Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I'm Priya Anand, I'm a reporter at Bloomberg News, and I'm really excited to introduce Congresswoman Judy Chu to everybody. She represents California's 27th district, and she's also on the board of APAICS. Thank you, Judy.
Hello, I'm Congressmember Judy Chu, and as the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call CAPAC, I'm so happy to be with you today for the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies' first ever Tech Summit. This is such an exciting opportunity for us to encourage more AAPI diversity and visibility in one of our country's most important sectors. And so I want to thank Madeline Milka and APAICS for hosting it, and all of you for taking part, because representation is something that I care deeply about. You see, for years, AAPIs in Washington, D.C. were practically invisible. That meant that our communities were left out of important policy discussions. But today, all of that is changing. Today, we have a record 21 AAPI members of Congress, our highest number ever. And in January, AAPI shattered one of the highest glass ceilings of all when Kamala Harris was sworn in as our first woman, Black, and Asian vice president in history. We also have a number of prominent AAPIs serving in the federal government, and there are other AAPI leaders throughout the Biden administration who are bringing new perspectives and experiences to important national conversations, like Surgeon General Vivek Murthy and Deputy Labor Secretary Julie Su. All of this has had an incredible impact. Because of this growing influence, we were able to fight to make sure that COVID-19 aid for small businesses was translated so that non-English speaking entrepreneurs could get the help they need. And in response to the crisis of rising anti-Asian hate, we were able to pass and sign into law the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. But we need to see this change happening throughout American society, and that includes Silicon Valley. Like the model minority myth that assumes all Asian Americans are high achievers, there is a myth in Silicon Valley that AAPIs are actually overrepresented. But as with the model minority myth, a closer look at the numbers can tell you a lot. For instance, between 2000 and 2010, AAPI representation in Silicon Valley increased from about 38 to 50%. But the number of AAPIs among senior executives is just 11%. And it's even worse when you combine it with the gender gap. A white male is 42% more likely to be a Silicon Valley CEO than a white woman. But when it's a white man versus an Asian woman, it becomes 260% more likely that it will go to the white man. That's an incredible disconnect that should raise alarm bells. AAPIs are not being promoted or rising up to management positions, and that can have serious consequences. For one, diversity in company leadership is crucial, especially as a business grows and expands into international markets. Diverse leaders can help navigate different cultures and attract local talent. But a lack of diversity can be felt in other ways throughout a company, from missing out on employee ideas to missing important voices that could help with addressing things like the spread of hate online. And without representation among executive leadership, AAPI employees have fewer role models and fewer internal champions to guide and mentor them. Corporate leaders also have fewer internal resources to guide them in fully understanding the needs and aspirations of AAPI consumers. That's why I'm so glad you are having this conversation today, and why in 2016, CAPAC led a letter to Fortune 100 companies urging them to address the lack of diversity in their ranks. And it is why we will be doing the same again this year, including to many Silicon Valley companies. We are asking these companies to make available statistics on AAPI representation in the C-suite and among senior executive management, for information on their programs to advance diversity, the amount of support they give to AAPI community causes, and how many AAPI businesses receive their contract dollars. By encouraging this conversation in a public way, we can help close that gap and encourage better representation. So thank you again for your leadership in hosting today's summit. and for your incredible work at encouraging diversity and representation at every level. I am proud to stand with you.
That was great. We have a wonderful panel for you all today. I'm going to turn it over to the panelists so they can introduce themselves. And let's start with you, Buck.
Hi, I'm Buck G, and I'm currently an executive advisor for Ascend Foundation. I spent 36 years in Silicon Valley in engineering and marketing and ultimately in management, including big companies, small companies. I worked in 6 different startups. My last job, I retired in 2008, was as general manager and vice president of a division inside Cisco.
Emily?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Priya. I'm Emily Chi. I'm the Director of Tech, Telecom, and Media, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Previous to AAJC, I was a graduate student at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I did some studying on product management and the effect on minority communities and designing for equity, as well as some studies about how product management and technology policy in general can be better designed to be more inclusive of communities like AAPIs. And previous to that, I worked in Silicon Valley in doing data ethics and privacy. So we were thinking all the time about diversity and how our policies and our products were affecting minority communities. So happy to be here.
And we'll also be joined by Jason Chan, who is the Director of Strategic Alliances at AT&T. He'll be joining us momentarily on here. So I want to start by telling everybody a little bit about my own background as well. I've written about this issue of the leadership gap in terms of the number of Asian Americans in the tech industry and this ceiling and this wall that everyone hits when they're trying to go up the path of promotion. And what was clear was Buck's research earlier in about 2017, right, Buck? You came out with some research for Ascend on this leadership gap. That research was really foundational to every discussion on this topic. So I'd love to turn it over to you to tell everyone a little bit about how you realized that this was a problem that you needed to dig into a little bit further.
Sure. I had not thought about racial diversity in my career. I basically focused on having fun and doing work in Silicon Valley. But it wasn't until 2006. I'd been acquired by Cisco. I had CEO of a company at Silicon Valley. I was acquired by Cisco, became a general manager and a vice president. And one day I was sitting at my desk and I suddenly realized, or asked the question, I think I'm the only East Asian vice president in development. So I asked Charlie Giancarlo, who was the head of development at the time, and I said, Charlie, am I the only one? I was acquired, so maybe there's some people I met. He said, Buck, you are the only one. I've often noticed that, and what's going on and what we can do about it. So that took me on a trip that basically where I found inside Cisco in engineering where I was working development. It was roughly 20 to 25% East Asian, roughly 6% overall Asian. And I was one out of 104 vice presidents. And I decided at that point that, we need to get the data and raise the issue. And when I began to raise inside Cisco, the feedback was, we never thought about this. We never realized this, but let's do something. And John Chambers, who at the time was CEO, said, yeah, Buck, and if the numbers are what you say, let's fix it. And so that taught me that data makes a difference. And so after I left Cisco and retired, I keep working on the data and found the same thing in other companies and generally nationally. And that's when we began to write reports for Ascend.
And welcome, Jason. We were just getting started here, so you didn't miss anything except for Buck's incredible introduction about his own experience realizing the extent of this problem in his own career. And that was in 2006, right? When you had that realization at Cisco that you were one out of 104. And so I want to bring us to now, because it's been more than a decade since then. And even now, this is a really prevalent and honestly, it's mind-boggling the extent to which this problem still exists, right? So Facebook, for example, is 46% Asian in the US, yet only 26% when you get to director level or higher.
Right.
So these are some of the biggest companies, most powerful companies in the world, in our economy. So it's not, when we talk about Silicon Valley, it's not just Silicon Valley, right? It's not just a bunch of people doing computer stuff in California. So I do want to encourage the audience right now, before we dig deeper, if you have any questions, if you have anything that there is anything on your mind that you really want to get out of this panel, we want to make this panel something that feels really useful for you. And feel free to drop in any questions anytime into the YouTube comments. That's where our team can pull them up for us so we can all chat through whatever issues you've got on your mind. So anyone watching, feel free to drop questions into the YouTube comments. So I wanted to hear from you all on how do we get companies, Buck, in your experience, it seems like when you're at Cisco, once you raised the problem, everyone said, oh, we didn't realize this was a thing. Now that we know that this is a problem, let's talk about how to fix it. But now, more than a decade later, we have seen that for years and years, companies have been putting out diversity reports, right? Sharing their figures. Yet we haven't really seen that much movement on this issue. We've still seen that this gap in leadership exists. So how do we convince companies and their leaders that diversity is important? Diversity has a real impact on their products and their impact on our world. I'd love to hear from you all on that. Emily, maybe you can share with us some of your work.
Sure. That's a great question. And we certainly deal with that at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, in our partnerships with different companies. Like we work directly with Jason, for example, and AT&T. But we really see our role as advocates to raise these issues and remind companies why, they have the ethical responsibility to care about equity, but also that they have a reason to invest in it from a profit and just company standpoint, because there is a benefit to them. So, the Congresswoman brought up a great point, which is in the example of anti-hate, we saw a lot of the companies kind of surprised that, especially the platform companies online, they were surprised that they had a role in spreading anti-Asian sentiment and exacerbating it, even though they have, all these engineers, all these brilliant policy people, et cetera, who are of Asian descent working on their teams. They were kind of blindsided when we told them that they played a role in spreading that hate. And that's an example we would point to and say, if all of the people who work with you were empowered to make decisions, empowered to report on the issues that they're seeing that affect our communities, this could have been a problem that was brought up earlier and resolved. And even now, we see a lot of these companies investing a lot in external projects like nonprofits, communities, which is great, but we like to remind them, this is a problem that you are not neutral in, and you have the power to do something about it. So before you look to folks like us on the outside, consult your own groups. A lot of these companies have ERGs already, where folks who care about the company, who care about their culture, are already talking about how they, in their everyday lives at work, in their normal roles, can make a huge difference on issues like this. And we want companies to listen to their own employees who are already aware of these issues and bringing it to attention, but might not be in positions where they feel empowered to actually do something about it. And that's just one example of why it's really important not just to hire diverse folks, but give them the voice and the power to do something about it.
If I could just jump in here, and I apologize for being late. Fostering new AAPI leaders start with companies working to increase community leadership opportunities and really increase workplace diversity, right? Asian Americans make up 13% of the total US workforce, but just 38 CEOs, and that represents less than 6% identify as Asians or Indian. Across the entire workforce, Asian Americans, as well as other minority groups, are really underrepresented at the executive level. I think last time I checked that these stats, only 4.4% of all Fortune 1000 directors are Asian. And even worse, only my last check, 1.5% are Asian women. And within the tech sector, Asian Americans make up nearly half of the professional workforce. But this representation is not reflected, as you all pointed out, in executive positions, right? These findings really suggest a serious problem within the professional pipeline for Asian Americans. I think a pathway towards leadership starts with us making early and deliberative choices about who we hire and how we develop some of our employees. Here at AT&T, we're holding our senior leaders accountable for improving diverse representation across all levels. Our U.S. workforce is nearly 46% people of color, which has grown year over year. For the last 3 years, at AT&T, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders make up 7.6% of AT&T's workforce. 11% of AT&T's management are Asian American and Pacific Islander. And, those are good numbers, but, I acknowledge that we have more work to do. And I think companies should provide AAPI individuals with opportunities really to reach our potential, right? Become mentors for the next generation of AAPI leaders. That's why we have nearly 14,000 employees who are developing themselves as active members of our employee resource group across AT&T and Warner Media. Altogether, these efforts are really a large reason why in 2021, Diversity Inc. recognized us, AT&T, as one of the top companies for mentoring. So we have a lot more work to do, but at least here at AT&T, we're making very deliberative, very intentional choices.
How did you get AT&T to actually care? How did you get them to start talking about these numbers, to start making effort towards these numbers? Let you do your job even.
Really, really great question. And I will tell you, it starts at the top. It starts with our CEO. Our CEO this year was very transparent and published a lot of these numbers and came out and said, hey, listen, these are numbers that I'm going to share with you because I think it's really important that we all know about it. And once we know what the numbers are, we can work towards what our goals are, right? Prior to our CEO releasing these numbers, we didn't know, right? Only a subset, our HR diversity groups, they knew. And, it's like a closely guarded secret, these numbers, right? So I really give credit to our CEO, John Stankey, for being transparent and releasing these numbers. In addition, when he released these numbers, he went to his direct reports and said, I want each and every one of you to come up with a DE&I plan that you will submit to me so that I can review. So that every direct report, meaning every business unit that goes up to the CEO, has a DE&I work plan that they can work towards. And that is, we haven't done it yet, but it is eventually going to be tied to compensation, which I think is really important.
On that, is that okay, Victoria? I think Jason and AT&T are doing exactly the right thing. My perspective, I'll say it this way. I think by and large, all executive leaders believe in diversity, but so it's not a problem convincing them. But I'll tell you, when I was working as a general manager, I was focused my top line, my bottom line, and my diversity person was doing the diversity, and I paid little attention to that. So making somebody accountable is the only way to actually make things happen, because it doesn't become a priority till it means something. So you can say good words, but until you make that accountable, nothing's going to happen. Be bluntly, I wouldn't pay attention to it unless it was somehow impacted my performance evaluation or my compensation. Kind of bluntly, because basically that tells me that the company cares about this. And until that happens, nothing's going to happen. By the way, the other thing is, I applaud AT&T's release of EEO reports. I will tell you, to reinforce Jason's point, let's say 2 years ago, I could find maybe 20, 25. Now I have somewhere around 100 EEO reports in different companies. So it is becoming increasingly transparent what's going on in corporate.
Let me just add, thank you. I think the work that we're doing here is really important. Let me add another element into all of this, which is pay equity, right? We talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We talk about building a pipeline and making sure that we have senior leaders that are AAPI. The other element that is rarely discussed is pay equity, because I think that's also important. And we continue to work on applying our pay equity practices to every corner of the business and the company. We're committed to pay equity, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, for people who hold the same jobs, have the same experience and performance levels, and work in the same geographic area. Getting this right is fundamental to our commitment to workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I will tell you, as part of the transparency that our CEO came out with respect to our workforce numbers, we also came out with, we realigned all of our pay scales so that everybody understood and knows, based off of geography, based off of your level, your job function, your experience, et cetera, what band you should be in. And we're as you can imagine, when this information came out, there were a lot of folks that were within that band, but there were others that were not. And so now we're working towards making sure that there is pay equity across the board within the company.
How do you get companies to take the bias and the existence of the fact that there is bias against Asian Americans seriously? I mean, one thing I want us to talk about here is also, what does that look like? What does it look like when you're trying to rise up? And what are the gaps what are the things that lead to this huge gap? I mean, Buck, I know you've done some research into this as well, and you work on this at Stanford in your classes with folks in your Asian American leadership program. But can you tell us a little bit about what this problem actually looks like when it's playing out in the workplace?
Sure. It's a two-sided problem, Priya. One, I'll characterize part of it is our problem and part of it is their problem. Their problem is implicit bias. I mean, there is a model minority stereotype that it is you're great workers and you put your head down and you keep working. And because of that, people don't think about you as a leader. Okay? And what they tend to do is if they have that assumption about you, they tend to just disregard those things which might be counterintuitive or counterfactual to the narrative, and tend to remember those things about you that reinforce that. That's a problem of stereotyping, is that you tend to reinforce your stereotype. Our problem is a two-part problem. One is feeding that stereotype by not being counter to that. To say people will begin, as long as you have those behaviors, they tend to reinforce that stereotype. So part of our problem is that, in fact, we reinforce that. The other problem that we teach at Stanford is that there are different manager styles. The most important thing you need to do that we don't do is you need to ask for what you want and be more assertive, and not be obnoxious, but be more assertive in asking what you want, because you don't think you want it, they won't ask you whether you need it or not. So you've got to be sure you take that first step. If you take the first step, that's the most important thing you can do.
Yeah, let me if I could just add to that. I think that there's accountability on you, the individual, to help yourself, right? But oftentimes it's very difficult to help yourself if the infrastructure is not set up in a way that can be helpful to you. So that's one. You need to have good leadership within an organization and within companies. But you have to have outside help as well. I think it may have been this year or last year, there was a legislator in California, the vice chair of the API Caucus, Assemblymember Evan Lowe. He helped author and passed a bill in California that required corporate boards to have minorities and to have more women, to have more LGBT people. And I think that, when you talk about leadership at the top, right, you need to have people that look like us, that think like us at these corporate boards. And so I think, I really want to give credit where credit is due to people like Assemblymember Evan Lowe in California for authoring and shepherding that bill, demonstrating leadership to make sure that corporations like AT&T have minorities and women on the board. By the way, when that bill passed, while we weren't subject to it because we're not headquartered in California, we have minorities and women on our board. So, it didn't matter for us, at least, because we already had those systems in place and those people on board. But there are other companies that do not. And so that's why it was really important when, Assemblymember Evan Lowe helped lead the negotiation and eventual passing of that legislation. It is really about empowering APIs in government to change policy and to change law, right? We talk about moral leadership sometimes, and it's not always left up to the private sector. There has to be a partnership between government and the private sector for these things to work. And again, I referenced this piece of legislation that was passed in California by Assemblymember Evan Lowe, and I really credit him for the work that he did in shepherding that bill.
Can I add a quick story to that story?
Go ahead.
That tells you a little bit of the problem that we have and the solution we can address that Evan added, David David Chu and some others on the APA Legislative Caucus. The first language of that bill, AB 979, talked about underrepresented minorities. And did not have in the definition an underrepresented minority, and you probably know this, Jason, Asians. So it wasn't until the APA Legislative Caucus said, "Hey, wait a minute, us too." Only when we speak up and ask for what we want does it happen, because the assumption is we don't need the help.
See, I didn't want to get into how the sausage was made, but Buck got into it. But
it makes the point, Jason. Makes the point, Jason. People assume we don't need it.
Absolutely.
Okay? So we've got to speak up.
Absolutely. And but to Buck's point, let me just say he is exactly right, because when this piece of legislation was initially crafted, it left us out. And again, thankfully, we have really good, strong leadership in the California legislature with respect to the API caucus. Buck referenced Assemblymember David Chu. I've referenced Assemblymember Evan Lowe and others. And these are strong partners in government, strong leaders that we have, and folks that we can rely on. And again, it is about partnership, right? Private sector and government, nonprofits.
And again, and the point I want to make here is that the bill's author, there wasn't anti-Asian. He just
no malice.
No malice at all.
Right.
And so when men was proposed, of course. So again, back to the issue, we're invisible, we're forgotten, but there's no malice involved here. They just don't think about us as a problem.
Yeah.
Well, so the other thing I wanted to get into here, and now we're getting to the heart of this, is in Silicon Valley, it almost appears often like minority groups are in competition with one another for more resources. And when this issue comes up in interviews I've done with dozens of people who work in tech who are Asian, when you talk to them about the challenges they face in the path to promotion, the clear patterns that show there's a bias, everyone ultimately comes around and says, well, we don't have it as bad as everyone else. Just look at the numbers. At least we're here, right? At least we got through the door. And so how do you all, I want to know how you all combat that feeling and how you respond to that, right? The idea that, when we're seeing these reports and it's very small percentage of one minority, very small percentage of another minority, and then people see, Asian folks are not necessarily underrepresented. How do you convince people this is a real issue they need to be talking about? And how do you respond to that idea of competition for resources among different groups?
I'll give my answer is the following. Again, I don't believe there is. I believe that everybody believes in diversity. Everybody believes in equity generally. What the data shows is, for Blacks, Hispanics, Their numbers are very low in Silicon Valley, very low. I mean, and by the way, and they're not improving in terms of employment. With Asian Americans, it's just promotions. What you find, though, is that if you look at promotion rates for Asians and Black Hispanics, they're all very similar. So the point we would make is that the things we would want them to look at, which is equitable promotion rates, are the same for Black Hispanics, and solutions for Asians are the same thing with Black Hispanics. So the point is that there's not enough detail, not enough information, not enough attention paid to the problem that affects us all as people of color. I don't, and again, you never want to. Trust me, the money's being spent on trying to recruit Black Hispanics is a ton, but again, if you look at the data, there's been very little progress. My argument is you need to look at the whole problem, because whatever you're doing in Silicon Valley, the data says it's not working. So you need a whole new conversation about how to do this.
Really briefly, let me just add this, because I feel like this question comes up a lot for me with respect to other minority groups, whether it's Black, Brown, API, or even within the API community, right? And what I often say to people is that, like, everyone is trying to look at this piece of pie and try to figure out how we get a larger cut of this pie. And what I share with folks is, it's not about, how do you get a larger cut of this pie? We need to figure out how to make that pie get bigger, right? Because it's all of us collectively can do that work. So once we figure out how to make the pie bigger, then we all get a larger slice.
Sure. I'll just add that I think there are a few things that are really important to raise. First is disaggregation of data. So I think there's this stereotype that, oh, all Asians are doing great in tech. We, all know how to do engineering. We're all good at math, blah, blah, blah. Like, we all are highly educated. And that, if you look at the data, is simply not true. So even if you look at East Asian American communities, you see that there are a lot of folks who are living in poverty, who aren't digitally literate, who, qualify for food stamps, are low income, don't have high education attainment. So that's like just the general model minority myth that we're fighting every day. But if you have the disaggregation of data beyond East Asian Americans, it gets even worse. So most companies in their publication of data, they might not go deep into the weeds about, Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian populations. They might not be thinking about newer refugee and immigration populations that are coming from Southeast Asia. They might not be thinking about caste as it plays out in South Asian workers. We've been seeing more and more reports about how caste in Silicon Valley is creating a lot of discrimination and bias in the workplace. But because we're all lumped into this one giant category of Asian American, those issues get erased, and it looks like we're highly represented, even if some members of our community aren't represented at all. So I think disaggregation is key to telling the story of why it's important to include Asian Americans in this story about diversity. The second is education, thinking about the history of Asian Americans and what bias looks like as it appears, as it manifests for our community. So what are the ways that folks at companies might be discriminating against our policies? What are the microaggressions that come up that silence us? There needs to be education at every level of management to better understand how Asian Americans might be negatively affected in the workplace, because it might not be the same way that Black and Brown communities are affected, but it's still really important to discuss. And the other thing is, I think we as Asian Americans have a responsibility to build coalitions with our Black and Brown colleagues, right? So it's not enough for us to just push for more representation of Asian Americans. We have to make sure we're acting as strong allies, and remembering that we have so much shared history when it comes to civil rights, when it comes to racial justice, and emulating the generations that have come before us, because Jason's exactly right. Like, fighting over the pie isn't going to lead to good results. We have to figure out ways that we can expand opportunities for all of our communities, because separated, it's never really going to work.
The point that Emily makes about disaggregation is particularly important when looking at funding for the communities from the philanthropic community. You see the same sort of assumption there because we're overeducated and overpaid, that we don't need the help philanthropically. So that's what I've seen in my work in nonprofit boards, is that we're not getting attention of large foundations because they think we don't need the money. Again, we're an invisible minority.
Buck, I would love if you could share with the group, you go and chat with big tech companies all the time, companies big and small, about what they can be doing about these issues. You shared an anecdote with me when we were prepping for this panel. Can you share that with the group?
Oh, you mean, I think I know what you mean. So I go talk to this very large tech company in Silicon Valley, talk to the head of diversity, and show him his numbers, because they have been releasing their EO reports, and say, in terms of promotions, Asian Americans are just as less likely as Black Hispanics to be promoted into the executive suite. And what he said was, Buck, you're right. We never thought about this before. We never looked at this, because by and large, our diversity programs are driven by compliance. That is, we're required to do these things by certain metrics, and the metrics that we look at, which is basically numbers in the company, you're looking fine. So we don't look at the other problems that you're pointing out. So by and large, our diversity programs are driven by compliance, not by diversity. And that was a key learning for me. Again, there's no malice here, but they're not looking at the problem that we need to look at it.
And I'll just add, that just goes to show that this is a problem that's bigger than tech or bigger than how companies are managed. It goes to how important it is that we include Asian American history in our K through 12 education. How important media representation is to see Asian Americans depicted in roles that don't support the model minority myth, because like Buck said, if they look at the numbers, it tells one story, but if they have to be invested and care about Asian American communities and their employees, and understanding them as whole people that go beyond racial caricatures. So it's a bigger problem than just what tech companies are doing. It's really changing the narrative and taking back our stories as Asian Americans, because we've been portrayed in a certain way to benefit people in power.
And Priya, when you and Buck were talking about, charitable contributions and how, Asian American organizations don't get contributions because it seemingly, the Asian American community is fine. There's no issues. Why should we help? A lot of that stuff, there's a lot of elements in that, right? One is you need to have an advocate within that company, an organization that can speak to the Asian American community. That's one element. The second element is that you have to have a senior leader that is willing to listen, that is open to these ideas. And so if you have a willing participant in all of this, Asian American or not, if they're open and they're willing to learn and they're willing to understand issues within the Asian American community, then they can get a better sense of okay, yeah, now we understand the myth, and now we understand what some of the issues are, and we should be participating, we should be making contributions, and we should be supporting the Asian American community. But again, a lot of that stuff is making sure that you have the right people in place that have the willingness and that are open to listening and understanding the issues.
I want to add to that. I think I've been on a number of panels recently in the midst of what's going on in the last year, the anti-Asian violence, and talking to ERGs. And that's exactly my message to them, is that people are listening now, they're paying attention now. So ERGs should be more active and ask for what they want. Again, most ERGs are led by middle managers who are a little bit intimidated by talking to the CEO or talking to executives. And what I'm telling them is the executives really want to hear you. So now's the time to talk.
Also, Emily, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, we've also had a lot of discussions with ERGs during this past year with everything that's going on. And, one of the things that has been surprising is how little history we know as a community. So we'll talk to ERGs and give them a rundown of Asian American history, and they're very surprised to find out the level of discrimination and bias and, coded laws that have been made to, make sure that we aren't successful in this country. And that kind of emboldens them because, going back to Buck's Buck's earlier point, that some of this is on us because we have internalized racism within us, and we are afraid to ask for things. We feel like we have to fit into this role of just hard worker that follows the rules. I think learning our history is a key part of empowering us to do more, to remember that we come from resilient, unapologetic folks who have organized and pushed for better things in the past, like Filipino farm workers who worked with Latino farm workers to ask for better pay and better treatment out in the fields in California. And the ERGs have a role to play to make sure that it's not just advocacy, but they're empowering the people in their groups and learning together, so that they can have that going into these meetings and remember that, history is on our side and they have a lot of potential, and we're not quiet, model minorities who just work hard. We are so much more than that, and I think we need to do the work to reclaim that.
Go ahead, Jason.
Sorry. So, we talked a little bit about, and Buck, you referenced this about the violence against our community. And over the past year or so, unfortunately, we've witnessed increased violence against the AAPI community, right? Between, I think, March 2020 and June 2021, there's an organization to stop AAPI hate. They reported over 9,000 hate crimes and incidents against Asian Americans nationwide. And, this violence really produced quite a traumatic ripple effect, harming victims, their families, and our entire community. But, these types of racism-fueled attacks, microaggressions, these aren't new to our community. And AT&T's fight for social justice continues as hate crimes continue to occur in our community. We support Ascend Leadership Foundations. They have a 5-point action agenda to root out bias and promote inclusion. This year, AT&T and Warner Media, we committed $7 million to combat and confront anti-Asian hate. We also launched a multi-platform PSA campaign to inform, to educate, inspire others to stand in solidarity and stop Asian hate. And we're making donations across the enterprise to organizations committed to AAPI social justice through employee match-based dollar-for-dollar programs. And some of these organizations you all have heard of: AAJC, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, CAM, Center for Asian American Media. But I will say AT&T did the right thing here when we made that $7 million commitment. But what I will share with all of you is that that wasn't just an AT&T decision. Well, obviously we made that decision, but largely, it was people like Congresswoman Grace Meng, who's vice chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, Evan Lowe, who's vice chair of the California Asian Pacific American Legislative Caucus in California. And I will tell you, between Congresswoman Meng and Vice Chair Lowe, I was getting phone calls. As you can imagine, one is on the West Coast, the other is on the East Coast. And I was getting phone calls at 6 a.m., 10 p.m. from largely these two and their colleagues saying, what is the role that corporations have in all of this? More specifically, what is AT&T doing? So, again, as a result of the work of Congresswoman Meng and Assemblymember Lowe, really, and it's not just AT&T, right? It was many other companies really stepped up and leaned in to support our community. And, I will say $7 million is a significant contribution for us with respect to the Asian American community. And I will give credit where credit is due, which is AT&T did the right thing. But it was a lot of phone calls from Congresswoman Meng and Assemblymember Lowe that resulted in all of this work and contribution to our community.
So, as we've discussed, though, sometimes companies need to be pushed, sometimes employees need to really speak up to get their company to take action. Sometimes the public needs to speak up to get folks to take action or pay attention to an issue. So I would love to hear from everyone so our audience can take something away from this. What is the one thing, Buck, you mentioned this, Emily mentioned this, Jason, we've all talked about how employees need to ask more for what they need. What is one thing that Asian American employees should be pushing their leadership for? I'd love to hear one thing from everyone. If you could tell everyone just one thing at the top of their list, ask for this, what should they ask for?
Go ahead, Buck.
So for me, it's accountability of leaders throughout the organization for key diversity and equity metrics. And they should be asking me that. And that's something you can ask in coalition, in conjunction with Black, Hispanic, women. I mean, however you want to do it. But that's the one thing you can do, because until that happens, there's a lot of things said, but not a lot done. And that's bluntly my view of things.
So ask for metrics to be set, and then
ask for accountability. Ask for accountability through the higher executive team. Only when that happens, then how it gets funded, process. People are smart enough to figure out how to get it done if you make them accountable.
Yeah, and just as an extension of that, I know I mentioned this earlier. Our CEO has put out these employment numbers, our pay equity statistics, et cetera. So we have asked for that. We have gotten it, and now it's really the work that has to be done in order to close the gap, right? And that's where we're at. And I will say I'm very proud. As I mentioned earlier, the CEO asked all of his direct reports to come up with a DE&I plan for each of their respective business. So I am in the external and legislative affairs team, and so our group created a DE&I task force. Ken McNeely, who is one of our officers, chairs that, and I am his chief of staff on that task force. So I am intimately familiar with this issue, and I am working to make sure that we close those gaps. I will say that the reason why I volunteered to staff this task force, because I know that it was really important for our community as well as other communities of color. But I wanted to be in there, right? I wanted to be in there. I wanted to see the data. I wanted to do the work, and I wanted to be the one to push if things weren't happening. So Priya, you asked the question of what is my one ask. I had my one ask, and it is happening. The work is happening. The work continues, and I'm hoping that we are able to close the gap sooner rather than later.
Yeah, big +1 to everything Buck and Jason have already said. I think data accountability is really important, and another plug for disaggregated data. But I think one practical thing that folks can ask, you might not have that much power, you might not be at a giant company with a lot of resources, but even a lot of the smaller tech companies are starting to recognize diversity is important, and you'll see a lot of recruiters. For example, they have, certain metrics that they have to meet and special programming around making sure that new hires are diverse and that there's training for implicit bias and discrimination with new managers who are bringing on new people. But there's a need to expand that programming to all levels of the company. So it shouldn't just be with new recruits. It shouldn't be just with, new graduates and the recruitment programs they have at HBCUs, for example. It should be that process implemented at every single level, where if someone's up for a promotion, if there are openings internally, that same lens for diversity and inclusion should be included at every step. So pushing for companies to replicate that process throughout every level.
What kind of change do you hope or expect that we can achieve in the next 5 years? Because we've been, like we mentioned, Buck has been researching this issue for a long time. We've seen some change, but not enough, right? And this happens time and time again. We get the reports every year. People ask for the data. The world gets the data. the world watches as the data barely shifts year after year. So what can we tangibly expect in the next 5 years, or should we tangibly expect in the next 5 years?
Here's what I expect. One, there'll be more data out there. Okay, everybody will be forced to put out the data, the EON report, so everybody can look at it. As part of that, there'll be more Asian American internal leaders like Jason who are willing to push and advocate within the system. I mean, you're not trying to mean, but you're pushing for legitimate change that people want to see. Okay, but they need somebody internal to do it, because right now there's no mechanism to do it. There is, in terms of diversity bureaucracy there's no Asian, generally no Asian person or no Asian any person pushing the Asian issues. So I think that with more data out there, you'll get people more aware of it, and certainly in the climate we have now, where there seems to be more visibility with Asian issues, that internally in the company, people saying we need to fix this. So two things: one is more data, and I think more advocates like Jason. That's the first step.
I think I appreciate when we all say that we need more data. I think data is very important.
But do we have a lot of data now?
I was just going to say,
data now,
we
right?
have so much data.
Yeah, we don't have the, we don't have the granular data that Emily has been talking about, which is of course important, but we do have quite a bit of data.
Yeah.
And we've had enough data to know there's a problem for some time.
Priya,
but wait a minute, but no one's looking. No one's looking at the data, Jason. Right?
This is the thing. Is that so? This is what I was talking about. So I appreciate us talking about data, but I feel like we have enough data. We need what is missing in this calculus is action, right? I talk a little bit earlier about partnership, and I talk about roles that the private sector plays, roles that government plays, and roles that nonprofits and CBOs play, right? There's a role for everyone here to make sure that we take the data that we have and that we actually execute on that data. The execution part is what's missing. And what I have a hard time with on this is for folks to push, for folks to be aggressive but respectful enough to make sure that, hey, here's the data. What are we going to do about it? It's the what are we going to do about it part that's missing. Right. So.
Well, that was my second point. The advocate, you have the data. The one is the data, and then the advocate. That's exactly your point. Somebody's got to be pushing internally, respectively, constructively, and helping the company.
Yeah.
Emily, I want to be sure we hear from you too on what you think we can expect or what we should be expecting in the next 5 years, right? If history shows us anything, we don't know. We don't know if there'll be any movement at all, right, on these issues, as we've been talking about for a long time. But what should we expect at this point, now that there's a more lively discussion?
Sure. One of the things that I'm really looking forward to and excited about is that we're seeing groups of folks inside companies really empowered and starting to mobilize as coalitions. So I think for a lot of our journey, we've relied on individuals who have faced injustice in companies, who have, folks like Buck who took initiative to raise this to leadership, folks like Jason who have kind of had to get folks aware of the problem. But what we're seeing with, the silver lining of the anti-Asian hate we've experienced this last year is that a lot of Asian Americans kind of came into their own, racial understanding and awakening for the first time in a really long time. And that's pushed people whose everyday jobs might not have included activism or racial equity to realize, even in my role as a tech worker, I have a role to play and a difference that I can make. And so we're seeing, some of these ERGs really mobilize from just being cultural, celebratory communities to think, how do we make a change at our own company and make sure that we're counted? And, if someone in our group is up for promotion or something, for example, now it's not that one person going to bat and pointing to the numbers and asking to be recognized. It's a whole group of folks who are pushing leadership collectively to think about the structural inequalities that are at play. And now we're able to do it in community. And so that's something I'm really looking forward to, is seeing groups of workers mobilize together for each other.
can I add one more thing to that? Actually,
Of course.
what actually they're founded in the last, I think, 9 months ago. There was a network of ERGs and in the Bay Area, Salesforce. I think Brian Pang and Salesforce, a number of people in the Bay Area started pushing it, and it's a collection of ERGs, as like Emily's saying, working together, and having more collective power as a network of ERGs, all saying the same things, all asking the same things. They feel more empowered because it's a multi-company or multi-corporate collection of ERGs, and they all say the same things through the industry. So even within the company, there's this additional aspect of multiple companies working together too.
Yeah, let me pardon me. Let me just add just one thing to that, is that, you know, when we talk about ERGs and we talk about partnerships and we talk about building a network, there is another piece where, you know, like, I mean, I have my role at AT&T, but the role that I have here exists at other corporations, and I think it's important that we all get to know one another. We all exchange notes, and we all talk, right? Like, hey, like, here's some of the challenges that I'm experiencing here. Like, have you had to face with it? How did you resolve it? How did you deal with it? You know, I've been a part of a lot of these networking sessions that Nisha Ramachandran, who is the new executive director of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, she has been doing these quarterly lunches with API leads within every corporations and organizations here in Washington, D.C. The vice chair of the API Legislative Caucus in California, Evan Lowe, has been doing these quarterly meetings with you know, public affairs, community relations, government relations, API type folks in California. And as a result of those networking lunches, meetings, whatever you want to call them, you know, like, I've gotten to meet my counterparts at other corporations, and we've been able to exchange notes. And I think that that's been very helpful. That certainly, it's been very helpful to me. And, you know, we share ideas, and we, you know, like, if my counterpart at United Airlines, or my counterpart at Salesforce, or my counterpart, you know, at Apple has an issue or has a success story, you know, how can I help you with your issue? Or conversely, how can I help amplify that success story so that other people can hear it and other people can benefit from it, right? And we all help each other. And that is the power of community. And that is the power of networking. And I really want to credit Nisha Ramachandran here in Washington, D.C., Assemblymember Evan Lowe in California, for starting these sort of like government affairs, community affairs, networking luncheon, so that we can all meet each other and help each other.
And Jason, between the lines of what you're saying is something I've heard from a lot of folks who work in this space, which is you have to keep the drum beating even after people stop making noise about this issue, because it's a long process to creating change.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you've talked about that a little bit, right? Forming a community so you can have some support to keep the drum beating. But how do you keep that drum beating when, you know, we're maybe a year out from where we are now, and there hasn't been, you know, a nationwide uprising in the last couple of months or in the last year, and people are sort of, you know, moving on with their lives in different ways and focusing on other issues? How do you keep the drum beating to actually make the work happen?
Well, this is where people like Buck and Emily come in, right? Because I'll tell you, you know, as you said, this is the long game, right? And so when an item pops up and it's hot, you know, like, you're circling the wagon, you're doing the work, you're putting out the fire, et cetera, et cetera. But 3 months down the road, 6 months, 12 months down the road, the incentive is gone. The motivation is no longer there. But this is where you get your friends, you get people like Buck and Emily coming to you and saying, hey, like, what is happening on this issue? How can we help you? right? Like, and it is really about building community and building partnerships. And that's what I talk about when I was saying that, these networking opportunities, these networking lunches that Nisha and Evan put together have been really helpful, because they do help to motivate me, and we help to motivate each other.
I think I'll add one more thing, which we haven't actually talked about is, we've talked a lot about data and how there's a lot of it and it could be better, but, people tend to become desensitized to data. And what is really important to continue carrying the work is the personal anecdotes. So we're seeing more of that form as well with the ERGs and the racial awakening of Asian Americans, is more people are willing to share their experience publicly about how they've personally faced discrimination and bias in the workplace and what it's meant to them, what's the impact on them and their families and our communities. And those are the stories that we want to keep uplifting, even as the data takes a while to be updated and to be published and to be picked up by news media. We want to give power to the individual experiences that the people we represent are experiencing.
Buck, what do you think about how we keep the drum beating? How do we keep the drum beating?
I will say this. I mean, and Jason knows I've been doing this like it's not almost 15 years now. To me, my focus is that not enough Asian American executive leaders, and there are, even though they're fewer than I'd like, there are many. There are not enough Asian American executive leaders in companies willing to lead the charge. So we need to do that. Finding the people willing to ask the questions at a high enough level, and with enough power and influence in organizations to make radical change. And to me, it's all done from the inside. And I think Jason and what you see at AT&T is a good example of that. But there needs to be that kind of thing happening, and people and people inside the company, we need to keep supporting them, and so Ascend tries to do that. Ascend, for example, is just like Jason in terms of building a network. Ascend is building they call it Ascend Executive Network. Basically, finding as many Asian American leaders in companies as possible and connecting them and working together, and educating them and making them aware. And there's just not enough leaders willing to do that, because they're, again, like I was 10 years ago, just too busy on our career of building a business. But they're out there and they're willing to help. So we got to find them. We're not done finding them yet.
Well, thank you all. I feel like this has been a really solid discussion on how we can move forward and what we should expect things to look like in the future. And thank you everyone for sharing your insights, your experiences, and for putting a lot of weight into this topic. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Priya, for all your work on this as well. It's really important.
Priya, thank you, and really thanks to Madeline and APAICS for holding events like this. I think these types of talks are really important, and I think it motivates people to do more. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and I hope people learn something from the conversation and do something different. I think the question, as Jason said, talking is not enough. Action is better.
We've given a lot of people a lot of thoughts on how to take action in this discussion. So thank you, everyone.